Welcome to Eagles Rendezvous Bible Study, wherever you are. In the beginning, I would like to give us an introduction to the two books so that we have the context of 1 and 2 Kings in the Old Testament canon. 1 and 2 Kings is about 4 centuries of history, from the close of David's reign to the release of Jehoiachin from Babylon. So we're talking about approximately 1000 BC to 500 BC. So that's a long period of history, 400 years of history. I mean, Singapore is not yet even 100 years. Jewish tradition attributes Kings, the two books, to Jeremiah the prophet because of the way it was written. It's quite similar to the book of Jeremiah. However, Jeremiah was exiled to Egypt, so he wasn't there when the people were exiled to Babylon. So he could be, but there were certain things that demanded other scholars, other Old Testament scholars, to suggest somebody else. But whoever the author is not the point, is not the key to understanding the 1st and 2nd Kings. Because the author certainly has a purpose in mind. And he could be a prophet, whether it's Jeremiah or an unnamed prophet, but certainly a prophet that was inspired to look at the history, this 400 years of history of kings, and then derive for us lessons and spiritual principles. So we're talking about the author's purpose. And we can say at the outstart that the author's purpose is not just historical. He's not just regurgitating history and records of events. He's got his sources, actually. He has reference to, for example, the Annals of King Solomon, at least one time. For 15 times, he referenced to the Annals of the Kings of Judah. So even amongst the kingdoms, they have precise and detailed records of what the kings have done. And the Annals of the Kings of Israel, at least 17 times. So the author went to all these historical sources to look at the reigns of these kings and then draw out his interpretation. I love history, and my kind of major was in history, in particular church history. As you know, history can be defined as a meaningful account of a series of connected events. So an event is something that has happened in time and space. For example, the founding of Singapore, or the day you were born is your own history. It happened in time and in space, right? There was a date for you to be born. You can calculate your age, and there was a space. You were born in a certain hospital or at home, whatever it is. So the term history, however, is ambiguous. It can be seen not only to denote a flow of events in time and space, but also to the written record of that flow. The written record of that flow is actually how the historians recorded that particular flow of events, and he would have recorded that flow with an interpretive dimension. So there are two things here, not just chronology, but also how it was recorded and interpreted. So history is about interpreting the past. What does it mean for us? What caused all this to happen, and what are the results, and how we can correlate each event together. Therefore, somebody said it is a spin on historical facts. And so when we come to 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Chronicles, etc., we're talking about the interpreting of history of the kings. So the author's purpose is more than just historical account. It is didactic. It's teaching something. The message and lessons were Deuteronomic. In other words, it's derived from Deuteronomy. The author's purpose is this: the nation is supposed to keep the law of Yahweh. If they do, they will be blessed. If they do not, they will be cursed. The author understood that history was his story, God's story. In other words, this is divine commentary on history. And God was the sovereign Lord of history, using people and nations to work out his redemptive purposes. Now, let me say something else. You know, my friends, I'm sure you would agree with me. We all have an incurable fascination with royalty and celebrity. We love to hear stories about royalty and celebrity. So, for example, Britain's Prince Charles tests, or as we know, tested positive for COVID-19. It was like big news. I mean, there were now more than 180,000 people infected, but you know, who cares about all the other ordinary commoners? But this one is royalty. Or, for that matter, the Prime Minister of UK, Boris Johnson. So it will be headline news. Or celebrities like Tom Hanks and his wife. Well, that will be hot news as well, you know. And thankfully, Prince Charles is declared okay, and Tom Hanks and his wife are okay and recovering back in the US. And we hope that PM Boris Johnson would emerge stronger than before to be able to lead the nation, and perhaps he's leading the nation by example as someone that has been infected by the virus. I don't know whether he did this purposely, or you know, he never followed his own instructions for everybody to follow in social distancing. But in any case, you know, we pray for everyone infected, whether they are royalty or not, whether they are celebrity or not. But the fact is, we all have this incurable fascination with royalty, and this is from time immemorial. In other words, the ancient people also idolize the royalty and those who are powerful and above them. So, I have this number there, 42. It is not the latest figure in COVID-19 infection. If it is, then this will be great news for the world. 42, there are 42 kings in Israel and Judah, and actually 43, but the last one was a queen who conspired to become a king. But you know, in all the history of the Jewish people, they never had queen, always kings. So 42 kings, and I would say that people were fascinated at the time with all these kings. But why kings? Why kings? Because the kings represent the people of God. They represent the people of God in relation to God. God will take them to be accountable. And therefore, God would judge them not just on political grounds, or the author himself would proclaim his message by telling the story of the kings and judging each one not on political grounds, but on religious, spiritual, moral grounds. And someone has said that 1 and 2 Kings is all about three things. It's all about worship of God. It's all about word, whether they keep the word of God. It's all about weakness, because every one of them had character flaws. Their weakness in morality and in idolatry. And also, as you will read 1st and 2nd Kings, there were also references to the great prophets like Elijah and Elisha. And so the author wanted to magnify the roles of these certain great prophets to show their input and influence for godliness in the Jewish people. For our purpose in this series, I will not be looking at the prophets like Elijah or Elisha, because each one of them warrant an entire series in themselves. We just focus on selected kings. And of course, there are 42 kings, and there's no way we can look at every one of them. Even as you read the text yourself, you will know that certain kings have greater mention than others for obvious reasons, according to the author's purpose. So I will select those kings that are mentioned more than the others, because there are lessons that we can draw from these kings. So the method he used would be he interweaved both the accounts of the kings of both Judah and Israel. So alternatively, he would interweave kings of the two nations. And then there's a routine formula that he uses to discuss and judge each king, which we will see later. So, 1st and 2 Kings in the Old Testament canon. Where are they in the Old Testament? Of course, obviously you know that the books of Kings is a sequel to the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So it is a sequel, it follows through. And although we see them as historical, but actually they're part of the whole segment called the former prophets. And then the later prophets will be all the other prophets, the prophets themselves, the final books in the Old Testament to Malachi. So we have the former prophets and the latter prophets, and you can find all this information when you go into any Bible or any commentary. So just very briefly, just trace the history of the Jewish people from Abraham to the Babylonian exile. Okay, so I'm not going through everything here because you will have the slides in a PDF version if you sign up for this live streaming series. But here we have, you can see from Abraham to the exile to Egypt. These are the events and the references in the Bible. So we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then Jacob and family moved to Egypt because Joseph was there, and then eventually they were exiled to Egypt. They became slaves after that. And then the next big cycle will be from the exile to the monarchy. Of course, we have Moses, the one chosen by God to liberate the people from slavery in Egypt. So we have Moses, we have the Exodus from Egypt, and then unfortunately, because of their disobedience, 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And then later on, Joshua's rule over the people of God in the Promised Land. And the conquest of Canaan, the Promised Land, was completed around 1400 BC. And thereafter, there were a series of judges. I just put 3 of the prominent ones: Deborah, Gideon, of course we have Samson and others. Eventually came down to Samuel, the last of the judges, and the prophet. Now, there is now a turning point because the Israelites were in Egypt for about 400 years, and then they were ruled by judges for about 400 years. And they are still in a tribal situation. And the turning point here is in 1 Samuel 8, because when they demanded a king, and we can read this in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4, because the people, the elders of Israel, they were fed up with the way the sons of Samuel were ruling over them, and they wanted a king to judge them just like the other nations. So that was the start of conformity. They were conforming to the culture and the politics of the other nations around them, because all the other nations had one king each to rule over them. So they thought this could be something effective. But of course, God can see the motive. And God said to them, to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people because they are asking for it. Listen, they have not rejected you as a judge, they have rejected me. That's their real motive. And God told Samuel, you have to tell them the consequence of having a king. But if that's their choice, so be it. And so because of that, we had the united monarchy, and Samuel appointed the first king, Saul, and he was appointed on the criteria that is common in other nations. He's a tall, dark, and handsome guy. He's got that look to be a king. You want a king that is impressive looking, tall, and of course, Saul was head and shoulders above everybody else, and you don't want a king that is my height, and nobody can see me if I'm leading the nation into battle. And of course, Saul, and then David, and he had a hard time to become a king because of Saul, but he became a king at the age of 30. So David reigned for 42 years. So David, and he united everybody else, and all the tribes, and then, of course, Solomon. So we have the three kings during the united monarchy, and thereafter the kingdom became split after Solomon. So we have Israel, the northern kingdom, and the prophets that operated in Israel, the list of them, we can see Elijah was there, and Elisha, and the rest. And then Israel was destroyed in 725 BC as prophesied by some of these prophets because of their rampant disobedience and because of falling into idolatry. Now Judah, the southern kingdom, Judah, the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, but Benjamin was a small tribe, so they just called themselves Judah. They lasted longer, and those were also the prophets that were operating in Judah. Of course, Jeremiah, the prominent one, but all the other prophets were there too. Joel, Amos, Micah, Isaiah, etc. But unfortunately, Judah also fell into the same fate as the northern kingdom because of the Babylonians, and they were exiled to Babylon. Okay, so that's the brief survey of the history of the Jewish people from Abraham to the Babylonian exile. So now they are all in exile, and these two books, First, Second Kings, were written for them.